Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I'm an American citizen. I pay your salary through the taxes that you collect from me through the IRS because I'm a tax-paying citizen of the United States. I'm a woman, I'm a female business owner, and I'm proud to be an American woman. And I do not support your socialist policies, and I do not support your murderous abortion.
This just in on news at House of Decline. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is outside of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office, trying to put a halt to the Maoist struggle session going on behind closed doors. Now we go live to our correspondent inside of AOC's office to hear what is going on.
陈刚同志，您说的很对，很多西方音乐都很粗俗，不值得取。这是事实。您说的都很对，但是我教的音乐，
请说下去。
但是我教的音乐是革命的音乐，例如贝多芬、普罗科菲耶夫。
你是这么认为的？
李老在接见艺术院校师生。
他已经被清除出党、批倒、批臭，你还想引用他的话吗？
Well, wow. That was rough.
Wow. Welcome to the show. It's House of Decline. I'm Steven, and we have Alex here today. And we're joined by a very special guest, Jay, with, I believe it's your third appearance, Jay.
I believe it's my fourth appearance.
Fourth? Oh, excuse me.
Fourth appearance.
Because there was that big New
returning
Year's
champion.
episode.
Oh, right.
Yes. The epic New Year's. I believe what was going on inside AOC's office appeared to be footage from the Red Violin.
No, it was a Maoist struggle session, a real one.
Okay, and it was a real Maoist struggle session occurring in AOC's office. Really?
Yes.
Wow, that's really hard to take in. So I guess Marjorie Taylor Greene, that's what she was seeing through the...
Yeah, that's why she was trying to stop her, because she's a hero.
Okay.
Especially because Maoists tend to have their struggle sessions in Chinese. Like, that's very relevant to the Maoism of today. That is definitely rampant in the CCP.
100%.
And we're talking about Maoism because, and we have Jay on because I fucked up a lot last episode. I said many wrong things. First of which was in my haste to be woke, I misgendered Ghazi, the leader of Black Hammer, calling him calling him non-binary when he is gender non-conforming, and he uses he pronouns. And in doing so, I chastised Steven, and I'm sorry, Steven.
It's okay. I should get better at using the pronouns.
That we all can improve. But I can improve most of all by not being a jerk. And also, I got several definitions of several things wrong, including Maoism, third-worldism, my musings on authoritarian leftism, and also afro-pessimism. And we have and Jay is an actual book reader and knows about these things and can help me with my stupidity. So Jay has kindly offered a bunch of corrections, and we're having our own little struggle session on House of Decline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, listen, we can't all know everything, but it's that was a rough one for me to listen to, especially because I'm know both you guys personally, so listening to your podcast sometimes it's like, oh, I'm in a conversation with people I could just actually be having this conversation with, but I can't talk back to them.
Yes. I understand. It is very frustrating to hear people say wrong things and then not be able to correct them, especially when I could contribute.
You can always email houseofdecline@gmail.com any complaints or corrections, and we'll address them in the next episode if that ever happens again.
Absolutely. We are very responsive to fan mail.
Yes, I will send you all of the dick pics.
Nice.
So, Jay, last episode, I believe that I foolishly defined Maoism, third-worldism as basically just, the buy a world of Coke commercial. That was basically my definition. It was like all races and creeds getting together and, it was a very loose and vague definition. Can you tell me what I got wrong and what is Maoism, third-worldism?
Yeah, and listen, I don't want to belabor the point. We're not doing a reading group or anything. So, I'm going to keep it fairly general. But, one point you really kind of hammered home was this concept of a Marxist internationalism as being sort of a cornerstone of it, which is not necessarily wrong. But the thing is, that's kind of the most base classical any kind of Marxism. Like, Marx literally set up things called internationals, where socialists from around the world gathered and struggled and kind of decided their policy. And this was something that, ostensibly existed throughout the history of the Soviet Union, and that, the Chinese Communist Party had participated in. So internationalism, I think, is a broad kind of cornerstone of all Marxian thought. What Mao really brought to the table was, in classical Marxism, which I don't think anybody really is a classical Marxist, but his theory is very much set up on industrial accumulation, right? So the historical possibility for socialism comes out of the fact that capitalism has created these sort of industrial factory situations, so that which is both exploitative but creates the opportunities for workers to create solidarity with each other and more easily take control of the means of production. And what that does is it really kind of corners out the agrarian market. Like the kind of classical Marxists, your Soviet Marxists are kind of like, these kind of chum have to come along. The revolution's going to happen in the city.
So it's we fuck the farmers, essentially. It's like the farmers are just tangential to our movement, and it's really the factory workers that are of primacy.
Well, it's where the revolution's going to happen, right? And I think, it's not, again, like this blanket discrimination of people who, work on farms. It's just, in a practical level, when you all are next to each other, it's a lot easier to talk to each other about how you're being exploited and how shitty that is. Than it is when you're, 20 acres away from your next neighbor, and they're 20 acres away from their next neighbor. Yeah.
The idea of being a freehold landowner essentially alienates you from your fellow workers. That's a recurring theme as well, right?
Yeah, and that kind of comes out of the sort of historical perspective that comes from Hegel, right? Which is like, Marx doesn't love capitalism, but he really respects it. And he thinks that capitalism is something that needs to happen before socialism can happen, right? He doesn't believe you can go from feudalism to communism. You need to have an industrialization process. So, the argument, that's a lot of the early, 20th century socialist critique of the Soviet Union, was that basically they had tried to create a communism with basically without having industrialized sufficiently, which created a lot of the problems. That would be their argument. Then we get Mao coming in, and China in the 40s and 50s. If in the 20s Russia was not properly industrialized, China was certainly not in this very broad Marxist category, right? And so one of the pillars of Maoism is a focus on actually agrarian solidarity and the agrarian class as workers. And I think this is, and this is why I think in a lot of ways Maoism really took off in Africa as sort of a dominant form of communism, because it did not say we need to go through this 100-year process of exploitation industrialization to have emancipation. And I guess my last point on that is you talked about third worldism, which is a difficult topic to deal with now because we're post Cold War. But the concept of the third world comes out of Cold War ideology, where in the first world would be the imperial spheres of influence of the United States. The second world would be the imperial sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. And then there would be the third world. So now we talk about third world as any country that's poor. But then it was another name for it would be similar to the non-aligned movement. Yeah,
people that just simply didn't take sides between Russia and America in the Cold War.
Right. And so that third worldism for Maoism is a kind of reinterpretation of the internationalism I discussed earlier, where that there should be solidarity, but also recognizing the USSR as an imperial power. And so when you have, Sadat and Tito and Mao, these sort of really revolutionary socialist figures who did not kind of take part in either of those projects, those really, the former Yugoslavia, Egypt, in some ways Syria, and very much China, sort of for a period of time, created this sort of third position. You can't say third anything anymore.
Stay away from that one, yeah.
But yeah, so that the sort of different level of internationalist solidarity, a more modern one. That's what. And now it would be, again, there is interesting conversations about third worldism, but that would make, I think, any reasonable way about talking about it would have to make China the second world now.
Yeah, but so the third worldism now would be countries like Bolivia and, well, I guess that's kind of it, because Maduro's aligned with Russia, but Russia's not a superpower. Or, I mean, they are a superpower, but they're not like a Cold War superpower. They aren't like a second world superpower like they were before.
Yeah, they're a regional superpower. So it would be, I think you could make an argument for, say, the Bolivarian states in Latin America and, some of the states in, particularly in the politics of Southern Africa is an area where people talk about third worldism as a sort of political potential. BRICS was kind of, people talked about that. And the joining of regional powers, like, for instance, like Russia and India could be considered as a third worldist alliance if it was not run by two fascist parties.
Yeah, that's more of an axis.
Yeah.
Yes. But if there was there could be a viable workers' movement within each of those countries, and for them as two regional powers, that would create an interesting bloc to maybe mitigate the other two great world economic powers.
So, and the goal of third worldism being as sort of like a regulation or a check, a way to achieve solidarity without relying on these failed systems that have existed before and have dominated us previously. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and so there's Lenin wrote a really, probably if you read one thing by Lenin, you probably read the book that goes to the line. I think it's called Capitalism is an Imperialism. Mm-hmm. And the Leninists really had this theory that, again, if we're talking about, the Marxist idea of capitalism, of history building on itself through contradictions and creating the next system, the Bolsheviks really saw imperialism as a necessary consequence of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And so the Maoists kind of take that line and take it one step further and say, the competing major power is itself an imperial power. So it's the internationalism is really an anti-imperialist movement.
Well, it's funny that you talk about the Bolsheviks, because that segues into the next thing that I got wrong, which is my general musings around the authoritarian left. What did I say last episode that particularly... I can't even remember what I said last episode, but I probably said some dumb shit about tankyism and what could be considered a tanky, or even what an authoritarian left movement really looks like. Because it probably doesn't look like Black Hammer, which is what I was alluding to at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of broad. Like, it's kind of a couple of statements that I will kind of fold into one. But one thing that, because I think was also... tied to some of Stephen's statements about, worries about anti-liberal tendencies and sort of radical movements. Mm-hmm. And also, and your kind of allusion to tankyism. And I have a much less, chapter and verse explanation for that. But I do think that there are a couple things worth noting. For instance, anti-liberalism does not have to be anti-democratic. And actually, if we really think of it, liberalism as having ownership over democracy, then, we can see that it's kind of really incredibly anti-democratic in the way that it uses its power in states other than its own to wield that same power, in the way that it's really liberalism, or at least the countries that have proposed it, have really been probably the most pervasive anti-democratic force globally in the last 100 years, and has really the liberalism here has precluded the possibility of any kind of democracy anywhere else. And so I think that there are different ways about thinking democracy outside of representative voting structures. And I don't think, the idea that saying, we should, 51%, the tyranny of the majority should not, be the base stone for all social progress in our society, especially because most of the social progress we do like, if we think about the civil rights movement, was broadly unpopular, but because through the use of a minority group who would, if there was ever a referendum on, would have had their votes voted against every single time, through their use of, frankly, civil disobedience and violence had pressured the political class into giving them the rights that they deserve. So, even within liberal systems, I do think that the idea that everything comes down to a vote is true or good, and that's the only way for democracy to happen. And that maybe groups that we might say eschew some of those institutions and the ways that democracy has happened here does not make them authoritarian or anti-democratic.
So when we talk about, but do you think a more authoritarian left is an antidote to a lot of the problems that we face organizing against the, as you said, undemocratic liberalism that is currently the enemy of any social progress? Do you think, because that's what people have been bandying about, and it's sort of like this Black Hammer group cosplays an authoritarian left movement in order to sort of get people on their side. Do you think there's any reason why this idea is gaining popularity, or the idea that sort of a more tanky-ish approach would be an antidote to the excesses of liberalism? As you just said, the civil rights movement, only through civil disobedience and violence were a righteous minority able to get what they wanted. So I don't know, but that movement wasn't necessarily authoritarian. So maybe I'm just spinning my wheels here. But do you think it's gotten to the point now where we need that sort of Bolshevism back?
Yeah, again, I don't agree with the language of authoritarianism in that position. I don't, politics is about power. Politics is not about compromise. And this whole idea that politics is about some sort of compromise between two sides has really largely been a result of kind of Cold War and post-Cold War ideology. That's not how politics had generally run in the United States or anywhere. It's about, and frankly, that's why Republicans do better than Democrats, because when they have power, they use power. And I think, a left that has been suppressed for so long and then tried, through the failure of the anti-globalization movement, the Occupy movement, the Bernie Sanders campaign, have realized that a system that is designed to keep you out is not going to welcome you in. And any way to get in is to denudor yourself. So I think that there is, a growing understanding amongst movement leftists that they need to start taking different strategies, and frankly, the strategies that have historically worked versus the ones that have never worked. Yeah,
i.e., civil disobedience and a touch of the old thing there. I'm not gonna say it.
And, but civil disobedience, but also community organizing. People look at the Black Panthers as a bunch of people who just dressed up and carried guns. But, what they were actually doing and why they were able to create so much social capital in their communities was because they were community organizations. That what resources they were not getting from the state, they created the infrastructure for people to have, and including policing, which is why there were so many images of, why so much of the Black Panther movement was actually around gun rights. So yeah, those are real actionable things that you can do and that will create solidarity within communities, rather than petitioning politicians who don't give a shit about you, and every time you fail you say, oh well, we got to do it again next, we got to knock on more doors. Where it's like, no, you put food in people's mouths and you protect them from the police, and that's going to create a lot more people willing to listen to your ideas about socialism.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. I definitely believe that in the old adage of feeding people will get them on your side. I mean, that's what churches do. How do you think people become Christians, right? Why do you think every other homeless person you meet loves God, right? Because that's who's giving them food right now. Yeah. So, there you go.
I mean, you'll even see that, where I live now in Montreal, I live right by the gay village. I walk through it almost every day. And, COVID, looking at the COVID catastrophe, this is a neighborhood that is almost exclusively bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. And so now it's become an open air homeless shelter because there's there's no one to shoo them away. And you see every day, the people really doing the work are mostly religious groups who are going in and giving, wrapping people's wounds and, giving them food and medicine. And I do think, there is a valuable lesson to be learned from that.
Yeah. Well, that even then maybe it's not authoritarianism we need, but Gnosticism, which is something that religious people have that this sort of irony left doesn't. This sort of true belief in achieving the impossible. I don't
Yes.
know.
Well, no, all ideology is utopian. If any ideology worth having is utopian, and the problem is that we've all grown up with this liberal ideology for so long, so we actually don't realize that liberalism is itself also a utopian ideology, and it treats everything that's not liberalism as pie in the sky. But no, it all is, and you always, yes, we are probably not going to make the most perfect version of the world today, tomorrow, or in our lifetimes, but we are not going to get anywhere close if we don't aim for the goal.
Well, that's what it's great that you mentioned the Black Panthers too, because that directly dovetails. Speaking of like people that are not Gnostic as well, is the afro-pessimism movement.
Yeah. I mean, before we move on to that, I will just want to say that, like, I do think that anti-liberalism is a perfectly viable position. Like, I would say my politics are anti-liberal. I think my political actions and organizing and ideology are against the dominant mode of political ideology and where I live, which is liberalism. And so, but I don't think that makes my position or the position of my comrades anti-democratic. If anything, I think we're more highly democratic in our ideals than those we're trying to defeat.
Yeah, I mean, as a liberal, I am anti-democratic almost by nature. So, yeah, I would agree. Liberals definitely do not need to be democratic. I mean, that's why America is set up in an undemocratic way. It's, there's a special group of people who get to make all the decisions because God favors them.
Mm-hmm. We talk about Weber all the time. Yeah, that is America. That's we are the God's chosen. We are God's favorite. And that also animates another group of people that we're going to be talking about later in this episode. But before we do, my afro-pessimism thing was especially jumbled. I mean, I read the definition, but I definitely didn't understand it. And I probably leveled a pretty basic criticism of it that they've thought of before, which is, what about indigenous people, though? It seems like we hate them a lot, too.
Yeah, which I think is kind of which is, I think, one of the biggest misunderstanding there. I will say for the record, I am one of those people who teaches and works within a context of critical race. Afro-pessimism is not something I have been incredibly well read in, but I have, after doing a little bit of research, read and engaged with and frankly published on quite a few of the people who are the precedent figures and that they base a lot of their thought on. So one thing I wanted to correct is that it was basically that one where you quote Saidiya Hartman, who's a very nice lady. And she talks, and I'd like to what they're prefacing is something that's not quite so different as this phrase BIPOC that has been brought to our consciousness.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe as an aside, we have a mutual friend who was recently posting on Facebook about, why am I not considered BIPOC as a Middle Eastern person? And and they were like, am I not a person of color? And that is not really what's at stake. I think the concept of things like BIPOC and afro-pessimism is that, the concept of quote unquote racism as a one-size-fit-all tent actually does very little explanatory power. With the recent rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and conversations about things like model minorities, that is an absolutely racist and oppressive system, but it is of a very different kind than the kind of discrimination that people with black bodies go through. And so that's why something like BIPOC is trying to make a distinction. And I'm not making a value claim either way. I don't have much stake in the game, and it wouldn't be proper for me to. But the impetus for doing something like that is to say, we sometimes need to focus on certain kinds of oppressions and not treat all oppression as equal. And I think that to a more extreme, that's what you get with Saidiya Hartman's quote, where she talks about black bodies being uniquely defined in the system of Western imperialism as targets of or as sites of accumulation and fungibility, right? And that is, I think, true. And I think, especially you think about Okay,
you'll have to break it down. So accumulation of fungibility. Break it down for the dummies, which is me.
Sure. So I think what she's trying to highlight there is that black bodies in the context of Western imperialism or first world imperialism, to go back to Maoism, is transactional. They are things, they are treated as inhuman to a certain extent, that they are things to be bought and sold and
making
to
deals.
exploited, right? So that's the accumulation, is that like you can just take Black people and treat them as commodities. And that has very much been the history and continues to be the history of how Black bodies are used. And so, and the fungibility is the same way, where their value is basically, it's not the Kantian notion that every human life is inherently valuable and that the concept of, by being a human being, you have dignity. Fungibility of a human being is that they have an exchange value, which is in Marxian terms would make it a commodity. So, and as much as that is true, and yes, Indigenous people probably, have it just as bad, but they're under different conditions, right? Genocide is a different racial condition than slavery. And they are both terrible. And it's not that they don't have a conversation with each other, but they actually manifest in very different systems of control and exploitation. So I think that's what's really trying, is that, yes, we can't, just because I'm an afro-pessimist or someone might purport to be one, does not mean that they don't have solidarity with Indigenous people. They're just trying to explicate the ways that they are exploited differently and why those need to be undermined.
That kind of seems like an extension to the idea of intersectionality, that the idea that you need to, the idea that a blanket idea of oppression is not enough and you need to specifically focus on the individual ways in which people are oppressed in order to really find the root causes of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just kind of, and especially in minority communities, and that are, again, in a lot of kind of liberal, especially Democratic Party pretensions to anti-racism, are put into a big block, and they're saying, we're going to do an anti-racism for, all the colors of Benetton. That's actually not how you have to address these issues. You need to address them with a level of specificity, and that level of specificity has been denied to these oppressed communities for a long time. And so I think it is intellectually, politically forward-thinking to start asserting that. Another important figure that I think will tie us into the figures of the problems of the day is somebody I've written a lot about over the last 10 years, who's the Cameroonian philosopher Chile Mbembe, who's a very foundational thinker to afro-pessimism. And he developed a concept called necropolitics. So again, not to go on a huge diatribe, but Michel Foucault, he came up with the idea in his first volume of the History of Sexuality of something called biopolitics. And it is the politics of regulating life. So it's, one of his theories is that we went through it from a society of discipline to a society of punishment to a society of discipline, right? So before it was like, you steal something, I cut off your hand. And now it's much more about creating these regulating structures, including like mental health regimes, psychiatric wards, prisons, different ways of categorizing it, even, census data, all this stuff that we have, which basically serves a similar function, but really is a way of regulating the processes of everyday life. Yeah,
being observed constantly in order to regulate not unlike the precogs from Minority Report.
Yeah, or even what we talked about last time when I was here, were things where it's like, oh, well, how do we get children to sit in school for 8 hours a day? Well, we have this drug. So this drug, we can chemically alter them. And it is basically the regular error that we can be like, we need to get population control. We need to get more people, sex education to get population control under, or we need to get people fucking more because our population is not, is dropping, and those kinds of things. And that was a real part of a certain kind of leftist thinking. What Mbembe brings into it is basically that there is a whole other dimension, especially a racialized dimension, where it's not actually about regulating life, it's actually about regulating death. This can be seen in processes like, the extermination of the indigenous people and then the subsequent setting up of the residential school system or the reserve system in the United States, which is not really about about any kind of version of thriving or of keeping some kind of stability. It's actually just a way of creating a zone of a state of exception where basically human beings can be immiserated and can be connected to the larger society. And Mbembe is not an Afro-pessimist, so he sees this as something that's taking place, that is taking place and has taken place in many different situations. He spoke a lot about apartheid South Africa, and one of his main points is, of course, historical Palestine. where, if you really look at the occupation of Gaza, for instance, which the Israelis would deny they're occupying, but that's a whole other story. Gaza is not,
we'll get into that soon.
Yeah, but
it's happening.
That is a regulation
right
of death and misery, not a regulation of, and I think that's where a lot of the pessimism and the afro-pessimism comes from, is that I think they see the Black American population in particular as being in a situation of necropolitics, not as a situation of biopolitics.
Interesting. So basically, does this have anything to do with like the recurrent theme of social death? Like you said, the idea of isolating people totally and putting them at odds with society puts them in this state where they're essentially a living dead. They don't participate in life as we know it, but rather in this sort of liminal state between death and life. That does that inform that idea of necropolitics?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think an Afro-pessimist would reject that because in that quote you mentioned last time, they say something along the lines of, our condition is different than the Marxist worker, the non-Black queer person.
The post-colonial subaltern, stuff like that.
Yeah, and the post-colonial subaltern is very close to what you're talking about, which I think Mbebe would very much tie his thoughts to. Again, not to be a name dropper, but also I don't want to claim ideas that are not my own, but the post-colonial subaltern is an idea from Gayatri Chakraborty-Spivak, who part of what she's talking about is that, which I also think the Afro-pessimists would disagree with, but what you're saying, this sort of social death, subalternity, as she sees it, and as the subaltern movement generally sees it, is that by being subaltern, you are inherently inaccessible to the dominant group. It is inaccessible to you, and you are inaccessible to it. And that creates a kind of social death, or what that is, the condition of subalternity. Subalternity, I mean, in most people, especially the most famous examples of it, though, basically, those theories basically say you have to learn to speak the language of your colonizer to defeat them, because you cannot defeat them in your language because they will never hear you. So I think that is what it, that inability to communicate, and we're seeing that more and more with how, again, this situation in Palestine is being reported.
Right, so subalternity is the perfect description for the Palestinians, who are not accessible to the broader culture of Israel and who remain isolated, and who, I mean, they're in an even lower situation than what they described, because even if they learn the language of their oppressors, they can't get anywhere in order to defeat them. Which is, right. That's I don't know. But so for people, I'm sure everyone who listens to the show probably pays enough attention to the news to know that it's been the largest assault on Palestinian people since 2014. What was that one called at the time? Operation Flying Edge or Operation Cutting Edge? What was...
God, I can't even remember what these fucking taglines anymore. Honestly, they just come up with them to impress the Americans.
Yeah. But about 2 weeks ago, very violent evictions in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah started happening. So Sheikh Jarrah is this Palestinian neighborhood that borders the Israeli side of Jerusalem. And since Palestinian refugees went in there after 1950, and they've remained there ever since. And just recently... Israelis, empowered by a lower court ruling, started going into homes and violently evicting. We should just say forced removal. Evicting's not the word for it. Just essentially muscling these people out with guns. These people that had lived there for years and years and whose families have any sort of, families have claim to that land as well. The Israelis said, no, we had pre-1948 deeds to this land, which is why we're using our guns to get you out. So all sorts of property was destroyed. All sorts of Palestinians were evicted from their homes in acts reminiscent of the Nakba, the original mass eviction and fleeing event that occurred that was commemorated yesterday. And this has started... Palestine being huge in the news cycle again, and in response to that, Israel has is carpet bombing Gaza again and killing children en masse, and it's a horrifying situation. So that's just a rundown of the last 2 weeks. Jay, do you have anything? Have I gotten anything wrong?
Just a quick correction on a couple things. One is that I would say it is much less similar to the Nakba than it is to Kristallnacht. Because the Nakba was, for all intents and purposes, a military action, and I think you're right to point out that this is not a process of eviction. This is a process of citizen vigilante. Well, there's many prongs to this, but the so-called evictions are not, a lawyer or a police officer showing up with a deed, and you got to go by this many days. Yeah. What it really is a series of it's a bunch of basically assholes walking into people's homes and saying. And occupying them in a very literal sense and saying, well, I live here now, with the understanding that the IDF would come, the Israeli Defense Force, the army, would come and defend their claim on that land. But it's not soldiers coming in and running out the Palestinian population of East Jerusalem. What it is it's vigilantism that is bolstered by the understanding that they can rely on state violence to support their vigilantism. So it's much more like what happened to the Jews in Germany during Kristallnacht than it is to the actual military displacement of the Nakba.
Or to use a recent example, Kyle Rittenhouse, the guy that shot two of the protesters and knew that he could get away with it because he was backed up by the police. I mean, he's been charged. We'll see what happens with that. But I think it's a similar instinct. People do these acts of vigilantism because it's implied that the system has their back.
Yes, and of course there is I guess the caveat to what I said is there are very few Israelis who are not or have not been soldiers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also true. Yeah, because you see these guys, you see these Avis with Glocks who are just, it looks like it's from Call of Duty or some shit. It really, to them, it does seem like a video game in a way.
Yeah, and there's real hatred, there. And there is, a real, if you are, of a certain generation of Jews, you were raised to basically believe that your existential existence, no matter where you live in the world, is tied to Israel. And especially after the many generations after the, original settlers of that territory, this is, basically anything can be justified because anything that does that in any way might question their ultimate sovereignty as Jews, secular Jews, Jews in a ethnic sense, not necessarily even a religious sense, has created 2-3 generations in some real psycho shit.
Yeah, real. It's like for them, Israel is Oa, and the Green Lantern battery is there. And if you destroy the Green Lantern battery, all the goodness and all the Jews got to come back to replenish their Green Lantern batteries. And if you don't, you become a little diaspora goblin. And
it's pervasive in every aspect of sort of Jewry as well, because even very well-meaning anti-imperial leftists, this is the thing that they always have the bad take on. I saw something really embarrassing on Facebook the other day, which I'm sure you'll find entertaining. This guy I went to high school with, the most liberal guy in the world, super lefty, super progressive, and his take on this was to write an incredibly long screed about how denying the indigeneity of the Israelis is actually bad for the overall indigenous rights movement globally. And so the reason why we have to maintain...
Oh man!
I mean,
basically the idea that Cree, trying to keep your land rights in Canada is undermined by saying that Israelis are not indigenous to Palestine, as though somehow that is in any or relevant fact to what they're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, it also just seems like basically stupid because the indigenous people lived in that land up until they got slaughtered by whites, whereas the Jews left. We left to go to Europe. We left to have our Rumspringa in Europe. Didn't work out. They didn't quite like us. I should mention now that me and Jay are both Jewish, so we can get away with this. Stephen, you're on your own.
And I'm an eighth Jewish. So
that's enough.
I understand about 1/8 of everything you guys are talking about.
I'm an 1/8 Jewish because I smoke an 1/8 of weed. Yeah.
My green screen is blocking up my weed.
I think my grandfather was fully Jewish, and so then because if he had been a woman, then then maybe I would be more Jewish. But that's an interesting thing. What happens when, say, my grandfather was trans, and then he transitioned? How do you deal with that?
I don't think the Orthodox Jews, the people who are serious about the matrilineal heritage thing.
Hold on, let me finish. How do you deal with that? With the whole thing, with the passing down of the Jewishness matrilineally? Has that been addressed?
Well, I could square that circle.
Okay.
So first of all, the matrilinearity, I think a lot, especially because we're dealing with a fairly ancient religion. So I think there's two ways you could go through it. One would be that a trans woman would not be able to transfer it because she would not be able to give birth. And so I think part of the belief there, and I think it depends on which, sect of Judaism you're prescribing to, but I think that it has less to do with the gender category than it does to do with the process of being, sharing a body with the Jew at a certain point.
Yeah. So Jewishness is located inside of the vagina.
Yeah, it's a very much a sacred passage type of thing.
It's the passage of the vagina.
I'll give the Reform Jew answer, which is that they would be, because that trans woman was always trans, even if she had not fully understood her identity or transition. So she actually always was a woman, and therefore, so I think there's a conservative version and the Reform version. I think they're both bad.
I think just linearity as a concept in general is a dumb concept. So we can agree that's why.
Yeah, and the Israeli government doesn't follow these rules either. The Israeli government is a secular government. Most of the citizens of Israel do not practice Judaism. They don't keep kosher. They do not go to shul every Saturday. You will find more religious Jews in New York City than you will in Tel Aviv any day of the week.
Yeah,
right. Well,
the most popular sandwich.
I saw that tweet that was saying Tel Aviv is the gay and lesbian capital of the Middle East as a reason why the Democrats need to defend Israel. Did you ever see that one?
I hate that one so much because that's used to weaponize gay people against Middle Eastern people, and they've been doing that since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Here's the truth. Here's what you don't hear, is that every year during Tel Aviv Pride, or at least many years during Tel Aviv Pride, there have been religious Jewish terrorist attacks on the Pride Parade. There have been bombs placed under floats. The threat has always been there. They've not always been successful. But the religious psychos that do exist in Israel, but are just not a majority, actually do commit violent terrorism on this quote unquote bastion of LGBT rights. So these are also the people that are being protected with insane force in their settlements out in the West Bank and the Golan Heights.
But it's also just that moral calculus of, they hate the gays, so we can rain white phosphorus on their children. Like, well, okay, so let's rain white phosphorus on Alabama. Let's do that. We have enough more. If they hate the gays so much, I guess we can kill their children.
Yeah, I guess we could put Jason Kenney in the gulag.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, no. Stop this line of thinking. So let's just because we're doing a world history and theory for dummies episode. Can we go through like just a little bit of like the Cliff's Notes of Israel's history, like starting with Herzl, starting with Buber and Herzl, and then moving on to the partitioning of Palestine, and then the 6 days. Let's just cover.
We're going to talk about Israeli history.
We're going to talk about Israeli history a little. Yeah, we're talking about Israeli history. We're talking about the Martin Buber and Theodor Herzl. Jay, what can you tell us about the founders of Zionism, Martin Buber and Theodor Herzl?
Well, I think they're both very interesting Zionist thinkers. I also don't think they ever lived at the same period of time. So Martin Buber is one of my favorites. So Herzl posited, not ridiculously in the 19th century, that the Jews would probably be better off with some kind of sovereignty and not being the sort of heels of all of European society, which is, I think, a reasonable position to take.
When you're the Jews and you've just been shit on for thousands of years.
Yeah, and he was, anticipated the pogroms and the things that did eventually happen. And he wasn't always married to the idea of having it be in historical Palestine. He had, thought, eyes on South America at certain points, at certain parts of Africa at certain points, which, again, is participating in a kind of cliche historical colonialist mindset, which is like, these places are empty. We could just go there.
There's nobody using this.
There's nobody using this. So there is, always some racially problematic parts to Herzl, but he did eventually kind of land on historical Palestine for similar reasons as that as well, where it's like, oh, it's the Bible place, and there's not that many people there. And it also wasn't clear that it was going to be as colonialist as an entity. So then when we get to the 40s and 50s with someone like Martin Buber, who very much supported, he was always supporting a binational state. He, as someone who was also a religious thinker, kind of, I guess, the most famous Jewish existentialist, he and a Hasid in a way that we don't talk about Hasids anymore, was really not interested in evangelizing, was not interested in kind of warring with, having internecine wars between Arabs and Hebrews or Muslims and Jews. His version of Zionism was a much more utopian and much more something that I think most of us would, if that were to have ever taken place, we would not be having the issues we're having now.
So Buber's vision for Israel, you say, was a lot more peaceful than the version of Israel that we have now.
Yeah, and his version of, Buber also had other things, because Buber did want people to be more religious, and there is an argument that if Jewish religiosity maybe became more of a part of the foundation of that state, then we wouldn't have this weird divide between secular nationalists and extremely religious, also nationalists, kind of being used as foot soldiers in the imperial operation.
Because the religion became replaced with the state, not unlike you're talking about Kristallnacht and maybe spicy comparisons to Nazi Germany, but that's very much what happened in Nazi Germany, where all religion was replaced with worship of the state.
Right. And so when you get to, and something that a lot of Jews don't like to talk about unless they're actually in Israel with Israeli Jews, is that so the Balfour Agreement was, so the British used to be in control of what was then called historical Palestine, where Israel and the Palestinian territories now are. There was an agreement after the First World War to kind of basically set up this still held British territory between Jews and Muslims. And actually, a lot of, Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, and a lot of people who were young during his premiership and became later political leaders, part of the reason they were able to get the British out was by committing violent acts of terror and guerrilla terror tactics that they often condemned the Palestinians for using. That's how Israel got its independence. By the most famous incident being the bombing of the King David Hotel, where a lot of British diplomats were staying, and they were the early Zionists who had found the state of Israel were very much keen to use anti-imperial revolutionary violence to get their sovereign state.
Oh, like Hamas? Are you saying? You're saying they're a little like Hamas? You're saying?
Maybe closer to the PLO, but
yeah, we like Arafat. Arafat all the way. We're big Arafat fans here.
Yes, Arafat fan.
Yeah.
And then I'm just trying, again, you wanted the Coles notes.
Well, we're doing the Coles notes, the Bridges notes. Okay, so we got the Balfour Agreement. We got the Jews. We got Ben Gurion and the Israelis doing radical terror against the Britons in order to gain some semblance of sovereignty. Is there more between that and the partition of Palestine in 1948? Is just like the increasing Jewish settlement in that time? Was that a thing?
Yes. So what kind of in between the period between 48 and 67, it is also not going to be said that the neighboring Arab countries were particularly thrilled about the creation of the State of Israel. So there was definitely between Syria, Jordan, and Egypt specifically, there was increased tensions because even, so that created the series of conflicts which led to the 67 war, which created the kind of current partition that since, at least the Oslo Agreement has kind of been the quote unquote basis for any two-state solution.
So, the important dates would be 1948, which is when the official partitioning of Palestine happened after World War II. And that's when the Nakba happened, which was the large expulsion of Palestinian people who had been on that land for thousands of years. And then just that encroaching led to 1967, the 6 Days War. What happened in the 6 Days War?
The 6 Days War, the Israelis were, and just a little context. I think it's absolutely fair to call Israel a client state of America right now. But in this early Cold War period, that was definitely not the case. For most of the reading I've done, it was actually the French that were the greatest supplier of weapons in these situations. So they were really, and frankly, the Soviet Union. So the 6 Days War was basically, the surrounding Arab states kind of had a coordinated effort to invade Israel and basically try to get rid of it. The Israelis, if you're someone who's into military history, were actually, the Egyptians were also fucked up real bad. But basically, that's sort of the great heroic moment for the Israeli military. They were this small, plucky force against these historically, enemy states, and that even though they were against all odds, they were able to push back the invaders. And also, by doing so, they were also able to actually take more territory. So they were able to take some of Egypt's territory, and then the territory that we now know as, say, the Golan Heights was also annexed from Syria in that war, and that's when the really hard. There always was a hard border, but it really became the current version of the Israeli military state, and the way that they policed the Palestinians was established after that war.
Yeah, so that the 6 Days War would never happen again. We have to do this. We have to have an open-air prison and a land with no sovereignty that's somewhat less like an open-air prison, but still pretty much there.
I would like to wait for the use of the term open-air prison till the Gaza thing that happens in 2005, because I do think that there is a real shift in towards I do think the Gaza situation is incredibly different than the West Bank situation, and that is a 21st century phenomenon, not a 20th century phenomenon. So there it is an apartheid. It is the official, I would say, resolution of the apartheid state.
When did they stop letting them leave? Was that 2005 or was that earlier? Their travel back and forth has always been policed, and as in all in very similar ways to the apartheid system in South Africa, which is why the anti-apartheid movement in Southern Africa was very anti-Israel, and kind of remains anti-Israel. But yeah, so there was the actual the fact that Gaza has become the Gaza can't leave technically somebody from the West Bank, it would be incredibly difficult and fucked up, but they could get into Greater Israel to work or be somebody's housekeeper or something. That could happen. That will not happen for a Gazan in the current situation. And that started to happen in 2005. Mm-hmm. But it's this is a good time to bring up that there are different levels, as in South African apartheid, not all Arabs are and Palestinians are treated the same. So there are Arab Israeli citizens
who have voting rights. They technically, under the Supreme Court, and this has been often supported by this courts, basically have the same rights, or at least have second-class citizen rights. The Palestinians in the occupied West Bank do not have those rights. And the Palestinians in Gaza very, very much don't have those rights. That's relevant because there is another exception, which is that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are not Arab-Israeli citizens. They are in a weird liminal state between the two. So that's another reason why a lot of these quote-unquote evictions are being allowed. They could not do this in their own legal constitutional framework. Like, the courts would not uphold this if they did this in a neighborhood of Arab Israelis, citizens in Tel Aviv. The reason they're able to do it within their own legal system is because the East Jerusalem Arabs do not have citizen status.
So they're just using, in the same way that they've always used just obscure legalism in order to justify violence. Just the idea that we say these magic words. As Eddie Izzard would say, we put a flag here, and it's ours now.
We beat them with the cunning use of flags.
Yeah.
I think
it is pretty much just that.
And there is a veneer of liberalism to Israeli society. You know, it does. The courts have often not sided, especially with Likudniks, and have gotten in their way. I mean, just the very fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is very likely to go to jail at some point, like every other Israeli prime minister in living memory, it kind of shows that the courts are at least not fully handmaidens to the federal government. So that would be an interesting.
There's been some talk that this recent violence is a ploy by Netanyahu to stay in office. Do you think that holds water?
100%, because that's also been true of every other time this has happened, anytime he's been in power. When you go back to the last one in 2014 was actually in a similar situation where there was a series of elections that went awry, and it became, it's twofold. I think there is one where it does. So yes, there is no matter what, the vast majority of Israelis are going to get behind violence against Palestinians. So if you're losing popularity, you still go, the ultimate existential cause will always supersede any political situation, which has really been detrimental to Israeli society because they always end up voting, people have terrible policies that, frankly, they don't agree with, they end up voting for the ones who are going to be the most hawkish. Which has really been Likud's advantage. And what's happening now is slightly different, perhaps, we'll see, because this is probably the greatest political turmoil Israel has ever faced, in that the actual government is completely non-functioning right now. They've had like 4 elections. I think they're trying to get to 18 because that's a lucky number in Judaism.
The Knesset is a Knosset, you're saying.
It's a Knosset. And so I think on one level, it's Netanyahu trying to contain power. But on another level, I think it's the greater apparatus of the Israeli state asserting that, okay, even if one wing is not functioning, this greater mission will still always function, despite the fact that we haven't had a functional government in years.
That sort of reminds me of like what I think the ultimate reason for the Iraq War was. It's something similar, which was the Pentagon saying we function after 9/11. It wasn't really about oil. It wasn't necessarily about an imperial land grab. It was just the military-industrial complex wanting to insert itself into history once again.
Yeah, just theater of violence.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most correct answer. You know, in the 90s, Colin Powell often opined about how no institution is going to, especially powerful institution, is going to defang itself. And with the loss of the Soviet Union, Colin Powell argued, we don't have any great enemies. And I don't think it's a mistake that Muslims, Arabs specifically, but Muslims largely, replaced the big boogeyman of the Red Ruski as the great evil that justifies American imperial ventures, especially because the American military is such a huge part of the American economy.
Yeah, got to keep it going. Got to find any justification to keep it going. So You got to create this illusion that you're under this existential threat constantly. Yeah. I mean, that's what Israel's all about, the illusion that we're constantly under an existential threat. That's why we needed Israel in the first place, because we're in an existential threat. That's why we need all the bombs and the guns and the armors and all the preemptive strikes, because we're constantly under existential threat. It's this sort of learned paranoia that, you know, I think you can only get really from being specifically in Jewish culture when you're from the time you're very little, you're taken to Pesach and told, here's all the times they tried to murder us.
Well, yeah, there's this, you know, I think, Alex had a boss once that we went over to his place for dinner once. I think it was a holiday party. And I think, and he, you know, and he was, you know, understands that I do a lot of anti-racist research. And he was like, you know, the thing is if you're ever dealing with a black guy, you should just be like, hey, we were slaves too. And I was like, yeah, you know, but they could probably trace it 3 generations. I couldn't, you know, ours was probably never happened and was at least 6,000 years ago. So it's like, I'm probably not going to do that, but I appreciate the advice.
It's the historical equivalency, but that's, you know, the relationship between Jewish people and black people. That's what the movie Uncut Gems is all about, and it's also what the movie Straight Outta Compton is all about.
It's what a lot of movies are about. You know, they've even got a couple of good Sopranos episodes about it.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, yeah, there's a fraught history there.
You guys all control the movies, so.
Well, that's part of, you know, in Israel, Jews control the media.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I bet
that's stupid.
So a couple other maybe historical events or moments worth kind of talking about how we got here. I think a huge one, because Israel until the 80s, late 70s, was also very much a socialist project. They were very much like overtly socialistic. They had many socialistic policies. They were definitely would have been within a third worldist mentality, and which is why they had a lot of support from the Russians in some way, shape, or form in the beginning of their lives. A lot of that starts to change with the demographic shift that came. Frankly, how my family got out of the Soviet Union was when Golda Meir got elected prime minister. Golda Meir was a Californian Jew who made Aliyah in the 40s to Israel. And so a lot of her success was with her, was very much in her ability to negotiate in English and Hebrew and I believe Russian. But so tragically,
unlike Aliyah, she didn't die in the plane crash over there.
She did not die in the plane crash. But so what she negotiated, I believe it was with Khrushchev, to basically let the Eastern European Jewry leave the Soviet Union and immigrate to Israel. So this ended up happening, but this is a group of people that, you know, had not really been, by and large, deeply connected to their Jewish identity in a deeper cultural sense, like not in the way that, say, the American Zionist movement that brought someone like Golda Meir to make that movement. This was more like, well, we're getting discriminated against here, so we're going to go over there. And they're, you know, we're socialists, they're socialists. Bob's your uncle. So that created a huge demographic shift in the population of Israel, and kind of generally more authoritarian because they came from a highly authoritarian society. And the other side is that, you know, the Russians, they also used it as an opportunity to, you know, clear out some of their prisons. So there is a reason. There's a lot of Jews in Israel who would not be considered, you know, quote unquote Jews, and that's why the ties to the Israeli mob and the Russian mob. You know, you'll see figures like, the Israeli mob actually exports the most amount of MDMA in the world, and the Russian mob exports the second amount. I'm like, it's the same mob. It's the Russian mafiosos that were sent out of Russia into Israel and were given kind of new purchase. So that huge demographic shift, I think, is in the 70s. Is when you start to kind of the authoritarian streak really gets a voting base in the country.
That really reminds me of, like, speaking of Jewish gangsters, it's like how Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano set up in Cuba before Batista, before there was a real communist revolution. Obviously, it happened backwards there.
Have you been listening to Blowback?
I've been listening to Blowback. I've been listening to some Blowback. It's real good. I recommend it.
Man, I wish I didn't look up what Noah Colwyn looks like because he sounds hot and he's not.
Ooh. Oh no, I'd do him. I would.
I wouldn't throw him out of bed, but he sounds
no, he's
hot.
got good base features. It's just his haircut. He just chooses to look like that. He could be hot. He just doesn't look smacks. A term I have gained from the incels. So
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. No, there's a picture of him where he's hot, though. I don't know. Maybe I can hold it up. Here, look.
Yeah, no, he's definitely hot. He just chooses to look like a Russian peasant.
You shouldn't. I have that beard type, kind of, and you just shouldn't. There's no reason to keep it.
Okay, so the 80s. Golda Meir. Conversely, you'd think bringing all these Russian people, the Soviet people, would make the country more communist, but in sort of this reverse thing, it made it more capitalist or amenable to capitalism in a way.
Well, it was more amenable to authoritarianism, and I also think that Russians in the 70s were not as in the 70s and 80s living in Russia, I don't think it was like, yes, this is the great world historical project that we are all participating in. I think it became very clear that things were starting to fray at the edges. But there's also, a saying, I think a not correct, but an oft believed saying about, why is Putin so wildly popular is that Russians like a strong man. So in the late 80s, early 90s, God, I get all these Israeli prime ministers' names mixed up in my head. I believe it was Perez, but I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. There was a movement. There was a movement for the elected government of Israel was starting to make moves towards peace and reconciliation. And this is when Benjamin Netanyahu really starts to become a major political figure in the Israeli scene. I believe he becomes the leader of Likud. I think he lost his election to the first election, and actually led a movement of right-wing extremist Israelis to basically revolt against the idea of any kind of peace. He is often, I don't know how much responsibility you want to ascribe to him, but he was definitely the rhetorical base of the inspiration of the people who ultimately assassinated the prime minister that was trying to negotiate peace. Yeah. Subsequently, that was the first, I believe immediately after in the next election was when was Netanyahu's first term as prime minister of Israel and the rise of the Likudniks as a viable parliamentary leadership party.
And the Likudniks are the far right. Well, far right. You could describe far right nationalist, state nationalist.
They are
group.
A far right national. They are not the most far right national. So Israel has also never had a majority government in the entirety of its existence. It has always been a coalition of varying parties. Some until about the 2000s, when the early 2000s, when the any kind of left leaning, even though they were also imperialist governments, kind of lost all political standing. But it was Likud was in power, but they were in a coalition with, frankly, people much worse than them bolstering them. And I think they only lasted one term. And the rise of the Likudniks really happens closer to the 2000s because it was the sort of more lefty governments that lead us into the late 90s into the Oslo Accords, which is the ostensible peace agreement, the beginning of a legal framework. Camp David is often talked about this. They got to all take the Jeffrey Epstein plane to go hang out with Bill Clinton.
Yeah, they all won the Nobel Peace Prize. As we were talking about our boy Arafat earlier, that was a big deal. That was sort of the final, the denouement of his years of diplomacy was these Oslo Accords, right?
Right, and I was browsing through Edward Said's The Question of Palestine, which was written in the 70s but amended in the 90s, and just kind of looking at some of those notes, and I think even he would agree that if Oslo happened 10 years earlier, it probably would have been better for the Palestinians in general, and they probably would have gotten a better deal. But basically, Oslo, without going into too many details, is basically the Israelis got everything they want and the Palestinians got nothing. Even the concessions they were given, the idea that these would all be based off based off 67 borders, but some reasonable, equitable land swaps for its instances of contiguity could be negotiated. Of course,
i.e. connecting Gaza to West Bank.
Right. And also keeping, in the Israeli interest, if they just went down to 67 borders, they would also lose some of the contiguity in their neighborhood. So that was the good faith explanation of what happened. Of course, the contiguity of Palestine is directly against the Israelis' ultimate goal of taking over the entire territory. And so they have never actually conceded to those parts of Oslo.
I think, okay, so there's the Oslo Accords, and then we get to 2005, essentially, which is when you said that Gaza becomes the open-air prison that we know today.
He didn't say, Jay said wait on using that.
No, I think that's
till
that's
now.
It's the beginning.
Until this now. Is when we wait.
Oh, I thought you meant wait until 2014.
2014 is definitely the exploitation of it becoming... Because that's the most death that has been visited upon the Palestinians so far is the 2014 raids, right?
Right. So what happened in 2005? So Oslo is, around this period of time too, is sort of the rise of Hamas. Hamas is a PLO is not an unreligious organization, but it is very much a nationalist revolutionary organization, or at least under Arafat. Mm-hmm. And Hamas is much more of a jihadist, extremist Muslim group.
Yeah.
And they actually, a lot of the reason Hamas was able to gain any kind of political power, political purchase, was because the Israelis and their secret services actually very much supported them financially and with weapons, and just the way that you support insurgent groups, because they would destabilize the power regime of Fatah, which was so actually Hamas is much like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were really, things that were created with the help of the USA to destabilize the Soviet Union. And then, it didn't work out that well for them. That's kind of what Israel has done. So that's kind of how Hamas comes to rise. And so that's, worth noting that they're like, oh, these terrible people. I'm like, oh, these terrible people that would not have any political power now if you had not given it to them.
Or or even like the North Vietnamese. Didn't we train Ho Chi Minh? Mm-hmm. So that's all. It always happens.
The prime minister at the time of 2005 is Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon is one of the biggest bastards in this story of Israel. He was a general. He was a huge hawk. But he...
I thought Ariel Sharon was a mermaid.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. But he's one of those mermaids that's a fish on top and a man on the bottom.
Look at this stuff. Isn't it neat? Wouldn't you say my collection's complete? But I want it all. I feel fine. I want everything in Palestine. Yeah, that's Ariel Sharon.
Is that a Disney song?
Yeah,
you're
part of your world.
Kicking you off the show.
He would like a part of their world, yeah. I'm Ethel Merman, just like Ariel Sharon. Another name for Ariel Sharon is Ethel Merman. I'm sorry.
So the thing about Sharon is, and the reason I brought up Oslo earlier, even though it's extremely relevant, is that Sharon, it was not the guy anybody would have assumed was going to be the one who would have given back territory. That was not his reputation. That was not what he was elected to do. But because of international pressure, because of the Oslo Agreement, and because the way that Oslo also denuded the PLO and kind of brought them under the heel of the Americans and Israelis as part of this greater project, basically making Fatah much more involved in the policing of their own people against resistance. They were like, okay, well, we're going to keep doing that, right? We're basically going to have a colonial client state that, we can have, that is going to be less violent, and we kind of do a more technocratic post-Cold War annexation of this territory. It went terribly wrong.
But what they couldn't have understood was that...
Right. And so what ended up happening was that, actually not unlike Egypt after the color revolutions and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, it was, I think nobody expected Hamas to come to win such a huge majority in those elections that they held in Gaza. Just in the same way nobody expected the Muslim Brotherhood to, but also, it's actually not surprising because in a society where no political organizing was allowed to happen and was frankly squashed both by the external colonial power and by groups like the PLO and Fatah, it's not surprising that the only politically organized group came to political power in the first election they were allowed to hold. And that's how Hamas came to power. And the Americans and the Israelis were like, because the whole thing was like, we're letting Gaza, we're going to remove every Israeli citizen, we're going to remove all the soldiers, and we're going to let them have free and fair elections and autonomy. Of course, once if they elected anybody that was not their chosen representative, then they don't deserve that democracy anymore. And that has become, they were like, well, they elected terrorists, so we don't actually have to keep any of our promises. And that's become a lot of the kind of the impetus for what they're doing, but they will still say, so it's true that under Ariel Sharon, and there are people who actually still will talk shit about him, even though he's a quote unquote great war hero. He removed the Jews from Gaza. What he didn't do was give them any kind of autonomy. So all the borders are policed by Egypt and Israel, because Gaza was a territory that was annexed during the 67 war from Egypt. So Egypt is very culpable in this as well. But that being said, more supplies do come through the Egyptian border than they do through the Israeli. So their electricity supplies are heavily are controlled by the Israeli government. Their building materials, fuel, water, sanitation. So there is technically a quote unquote government there. They just don't get to control any of those things that governments do. So the Israelis claim it is not an occupation because there are no Israelis in Gaza, even though they control every resource, border, and anything that might stop their ultimate immiseration. And this is why the language of open air prison has kind of entered the discourse on Israel-Palestine, because say what you will about the West Bank, and it's decreasingly the case, but especially in 2005, there was much more of a possibility of some kind of functioning civil society there, even if it is an occupied apartheid one. Whereas Gaza was very much not that, and they were isolated in a way that the West Bank was not. They were immiserated in a way that the West Bank was not, and it became much easier to have things that look like outright wars than it would be in the West Bank, where a lot of what's happening in West Bank and Golan Heights, it has to do with settlements and kind of small parts of the IDF kind of defending these quote unquote illegally, even under Israeli law, settlements of these religious extremists encroaching further into the territory. But that situation is a lot closer to the vigilantism we're seeing in Jerusalem right now than anything that is going on in Gaza in general, which is why in
Gaza
this current
is just
situation,
a full-on, it's a siege constantly.
Yeah, and Gaza is the place where they will put soldiers on the ground. They'll airstrike the West Bank, and I'm sure they'll put soldiers on the ground eventually. But earlier this week, that's where they'll deploy and really just shock and awe. They'll do that in Gaza long before they'll do that in the West Bank, because frankly, they don't want to settle there.
Yeah.
They don't want to destroy the West Bank because they want to move Jews into there. I don't think they're particularly care what goes on in Gaza.
So 2014 is the last time one of these flared up. And by these, we mean, as Stephen alluded to before, Netanyahu wants to distract people, and he's going, look over there, and killing a bunch of people in order to do it. And the last time that happened was 2014. But it's after 2014, nothing really significant happened as a result of it, except for it ended and there was a lot of bloodshed. So I think we can just go to today and why we think this recent flare-up why this has a different quality than some of the other ones in that we've seen a lot more penetration of the mainstream of Palestine, where before it had been largely shielded from most people in the West just due to a very persistent propaganda campaign by all media networks that are complicit in it, because we have a material interest in the preservation of Israel.
I think 2014 was a sea change in terms of revolutionary or violent events reaching the masses. 2014 was when the Ukrainian revolution occurred, and I feel like we all started getting smartphones in 2007, and people on the other side of the world didn't all start getting them right then. But by 2014, they sure did.
Yeah, you could also compare it to the Arab Spring, or even the recent spate of highly publicized police killings that have occurred and that have ultimately raised consciousness in the mainstream about these issues. But the surest sign that there's been some sort of acknowledgement that there wasn't before is the large video game company IGN did a pro-Palestine post, reaching many, many gamers, and GameSpot as well did a huge pro-Palestine thing on their front page. And I have never seen any sort of quote-unquote normie website do that sort of thing. And it might just be because these websites have editors that have the independent editing power to do something like that. But there's a real, especially amongst Zoomers, I've noticed, American Zoomers and American Zoomer Jews, there's this real anti-Zionist thread that didn't seem to exist before. And I wonder if any of us had any... is the reason just because there's more footage than ever, or do you think there's social the sort of equalizing nature of news on social media has created this greater awareness of Palestine?
I think it's kind of all of those things, but also none of them. I think that the North American Jewry, which is the largest population of Jews really in the world, there's more Jews in North America than there are in Israel. There's more Jews in New York City and Toronto than there are in Israel. Combined, rather, or Montreal and New York City. I guess those are technically physically closer. So I think as you know, my family kind of got to North America through the Golden Meir period, and as you know, refugees into Israel, and that began their immigration process to Canada. And I think even my very non-religious family has a certain, you know, to my mother who was an immigrant, and to her parents who brought her, there is this kind of like, well, they saved us. And there is truth to that, the reason they weren't there in the fucking dissolution and the misery of the 90s in Russia was because of the existence of the state of Israel and the political actions of those involved. I think once you get generations out of that, and that population becomes increasingly less religious, I think it becomes, it becomes less of a shibboleth for younger generations that they have to spout this. So I think that's part of it. So I just think that they're less indoctrinated, and not out of any kind of effort, out of just the fact that people a lot of these, like I think my family still to this day is shocked at how anti-Israel I am, because they were like, well, no, we indoctrinated you this way. I'm like, no, you didn't really do it. You believed it, and then you didn't really try that hard to indoctrinate me. So it was very easy for me to not be indoctrinated. And I think that's increasingly true.
I think I would agree. I think there's this sort of this individualist tendency in North America towards laziness and defiance has made us more peaceful in a way. This like, I don't want to go to synagogue, that's boring. But that weird laziness allows you this clarity of mind. It says, wait, we're killing people? We don't have to kill people. We could just watch Netflix, dude. Why do we...
Well, but also the political reality on the ground is very different. So, for one thing, it was not always true. But now that, Israel, and Israel has tacitly for a very long time had diplomatic arrangements with the Saudis, but they, have really just put it out on paper now. And so, the whole argument that, we are beleaguered, covered on all sides, and that might have been true during, the Nasser days, which definitely became less true when Sadat took over, and the normalization with their neighbors. The sort of existential threat narrative that they were selling became increasingly implausible to anybody with even the barest amount of scrutiny. And so in the last 20 years, the last 10 in particular, Israel has become much more bald-facedly imperialistic, not out of, I think, strategy, out of the fact that they don't have another choice. There is no exit. The Palestinians are not an existential threat to the Israelis. The Palestinians have no capacity to commit any kind of major revolutionary warfare that would be effective in this situation. And they also don't have allies in the region. Like the fact that that really the only allies the Palestinians have in the greater Middle East are actually in the Shiite powers, which is not what you would expect out of a largely Sunni population. So I think that a lot of the stuff is just becoming more naked. And I think to people who so when somebody says, "Oh, we need to protect ourselves," I'm like, against who? The Egyptians, who are your allies, the Saudis, who are your allies, the Syrians, who are your allies, the Jordanians, who are your allies. Or the
Emiratis, who are your allies, the Bahrainis, who are your allies. So it
doesn't make any real goddamn sense. And I think as we're becoming less and less, finding the kind of it worked for a while in the early 2010s that we're like, well, the Iranians support the Palestinians, so the Palestinians are an Iranian client state. Is not that's also holding less and less purchase as the idea of Iran as this kind of crazy boogeyman.
We killed an Iranian general. And then nothing happened.
And listen, I think the Iranian regime is fucking awful, but the idea that there are these religious psychos kind of just working off of like some weird interpretation of the Quran, I'm like, no, they're a political entity with political self-interest that acts in it.
Or that they
rationally.
Provide any military check to the power of the United States is just completely stupid.
Yeah, and so I think part of it is that they've just gotten a lot of the Israeli propaganda has gotten lazy. They've been working on the same story for 30 years, and like when you tell the same story, it's the boy who cried wolf. It just doesn't work in this current situation, especially when in the context of, as Stephen said, the greater ability to just see this shit because people, 15 years ago, you're right. It would the smashing of the stores and house fronts, the Kristallnacht-like behavior going on in East Jerusalem would probably not be recorded in very high quality and disseminated in the same way. And it's very hard to look at that and say that for anybody to look at that in any circumstance and say that that's an act of self-defense in a place where you are a racial and military majority.
Yeah. It's the footage just paints such an obvious picture that and I think anyone who you don't even have to know about the situation. I mean, people balked at people on the internet for comparing it to Star Wars, but it really is just like the opening scene of A New Hope, where you see this tiny little ship, and then coming from the background, whoa, this immense war machine cannot be fathomed.
The Israelis are like Luke and Leia. And the Palestinians are like the Death Star. They got a Death Star. They got all this stuff. And
they're the Sith. They have Sith powers.
Yeah.
You don't understand. Darth Yasser, the tragedy of Darth Yasser Plagueis the Wise.
Well, that's kind of what they're asking us in the West to believe still. And that may be the dissonance. That we're talking about, that the Israelis are not the rebellion in Star Wars. They're the big empire. They got an iron dome.
Well, yeah, and it's become, and their arguments are becoming less and less coherent, right? So there are three different things going on right now that are being treated as one scenario, and they're definitely interconnected. But first of all, there's the expulsions in East Jerusalem, right? And that's being treated. And so the mainstream media narrative you're getting right now is saying something is, there's there's this happening, and we're going to underreport it. And then we're going to what we are reporting is that Gaza is firing rockets into Israel. Now, the way that of course, I think anybody who knows even a little bit of the story has been following the news, say, for 2 weeks, would be able to see that the Gaza strikes, whether or not you think that they have the right to use military violence in that way, I think it's pretty clear what my position is on that, is clearly a retaliation for anti-Palestinian violence taking place on behalf of the Israeli state, right? But the way that it's being reported here is that, no, these crazy jihadis just decided to start bombing as if they were not instigated in and frankly, a decade-long military conflict that's been going on between them. Because we're hearing about this now, but there have been these kind of evictions have been going on the whole time. These kinds of sieges into Gaza have been going on this whole time. It just hasn't always escalated into all-out war, and we're not getting it reported. So the Israeli thing is, and the thing that Joe Biden said a couple of days ago is that, like, Israel has a right to defend itself. But this was not an unprovoked act of terrorism. This is a retaliation for military action done against Palestinians.
Yeah. If Israel has a right to defend itself, so does Palestine.
Exactly. So that's, that is purposefully obfuscated. And then, of course, the immense imbalance of power and the fact that, yes, Gaza sent out, the fact that these kinds of people think it's abhorrent that these people are allowed to have any weapons of war whatsoever. And that the Israelis...
because they're Muslims and they might use it for the wrong thing.
Right. So I think that's a huge part. And I think that contradiction is actually quite clear to people now, at least people who are willing to see it. And so, just the terrible way that reporting goes down in these hyper ideological corporate papers, they're not as good at lying as they were in 2002 to try to manufacture consent.
Yeah, I've noticed that. The New York Times has been pretty terrible about this. I don't know if you've been reading in the New York Times, and it is not a good place to get information about what is actually happening. They have not provided an explanation on why Palestinians are upset at all. And it's stunning, really, because I was like, okay, I want to try to... New York Times is generally pretty good. I'm going to try to figure out why the Palestinians are upset. They don't talk about why the Palestinians are upset. I can't find it.
Because they're a wholly owned subsidiary of finance and capital. And of course, that's their interests don't lie with anything like justice or truth telling. Yeah. But I think the other thing about the sea change in public opinion, and I think we are going to see. I think the Israelis know it's happening, and so I think that's another thing is that the Israelis don't have another 30 years of blanket political support amongst all parties in the United States. That is not probably going to last another generation, which means that they need to go whole hog now because they're not going to be able to take that. If they had a 50-year plan, it now must become a 15-year plan, which means it's going to be far more brutal and more noticeable than it was. Because the second they lose even a modicum of political power, all of their political power comes from being a client state of the United States. This demographic shift does not bode well for them, which means they have to go full hog imperialism. You saw similar things starting to happen in late period South Africa, where it actually became far more violent and repressive in the 80s than it was in the 70s, because the anti-apartheid movement was really gaining purchase. And frankly, the only reason it didn't happen earlier was because Reagan and Thatcher were really obstinately against it. So they've got their back up against the wall. Their imperial project is in jeopardy in the long term. And so they have to, if they take that land now, it's the Americans, even if they have a different change of opinion, are never going to force them to give it back, but they're not going to be able to commit this rampant level of violence, carte blanche, in 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. Well, so to paraphrase Master Roshi from Dragon Ball Z, a candle flickers most violently and brightly right before it's about to burn out.
Wow. That's a very good final thought, but we're at that time. So, Jay, any final thoughts or plugs?
I mean, this is probably, as somebody who works at very conservative elite universities who have very famously in Canada pushed people out for taking positions like this, I'm not going to post too much about my true identity, so I have no plugs, but I will say that something worth thinking about is, some of these other third rails, I think, are worth considering and really having hard debates about, like what is a two-state solution, what isn't a two-state solution, if a two-state solution is viable, was it ever viable, does it remain viable? And also, I think really pushing back on these arguments even further than they have been now about things like Israel's right to exist, versus and the fact that, or these arguments that have been used since we were kids on us to indoctrinate us, have less and less purchase. And I think we can accelerate their dismantling. And so I think these are hard conversations to have. They're often they're not always conversations that you can have, because it's very easy to lose a job or not be considered a job, or no one wants to be disowned by their family. But I think these third rails are things that we should be more active in engaging in, because the opportunity is now.
Yeah, that's a great sentiment to end on. And this has been the Israel episode.